Brothers and sisters, we're here in Berkeley in the edible schoolyard of Martin Luther King Jr. High School. It is a beautiful, gorgeous, lyrical day here in Berkeley. You can hear the high school kids in the background. They have a playground over right down there, and the schoolyard here is just brimming with fruits and vegetables. It's just gorgeous here in Berkeley. It's a privilege to speak to you in this magnificent setting. And today we're going to be talking about Darwin, the theory of evolution, and its problems and contradictions. And if you walk onto any college campus and you walk up to the first student that you see and you say, where have we come from? What are our origins? The answer you'll invariably get will be Darwin. Indeed, evolution has become the theology of the late industrial age. The mechanism is quite straightforward. Darwin postulates random variations and random and chance variations which occur, and those that are useful are selected out by natural selection or survival of the fittest, if you will. That man is a sort of animal who has arisen by a roll of the dice, has dominated thought for the last 150 years. Come to think of it, it's a reflection of the ethos of Darwin's times. If he looked out his window, if he looked into the street, that's what you would see in the street in Darwin's time. You would see certainly survival of the fittest, no question at all, in the streets of London. And if you look out of a window here in downtown Berkeley, sadly enough, you'll see more or less the same thing. So you have an ethos where startups arise, new creations, new inventions, new discoveries, new enterprises arise continuously, and they're selected out by the bellum omnium contra omnes, the war of all against all, as the philosopher Thomas Hobbes would have it. Only the fittest survive. So Darwin has become a sort of ideology of materialism, of the most primitive and the most naive kind, as we shall see. There are difficulties. Even in Darwin's time, there were difficulties. One of the least, by the way, happens to be in the realm of materiality, namely the fossil record. The fossil record does not support Darwin. And Darwin acknowledged that. Because if you look at the fossil record, in the Cambrian epoch, you're going to see 540 million years ago, you're going to see a sudden explosion of life with few antecedents. A great explosion of life in a geologically very brief period of time. A myriad of living things came into existence all of a sudden. Whereas Darwin suggests that life is a product of slow, incremental changes over an immense period of time. Lowly random and chance variations occur, and those that are useful are maintained through natural selection. Furthermore, according to Darwin, all life evolved from a simple organism and branched out in a sort of tree-like pattern to more and more elaborate forms. The fossil record, on the other hand, shows most animals appearing more or less at the same time rather than a branching out. The major challenge to the theory of evolution is to explain the large-scale changes that lead from one class or an order to another. Let's say mammals. Let's say fishes, for example. Let's say birds. And the transition from one phylum or order to another. As far as on the smaller scale, and I hear the objections right now, what about Darwin's finches? Well, what about them? What about them? On the Galapagos Islands, and an array of maybe 4 or 5 islands, on each island you had finches, but each finch with a different shaped beak, and the beak adjusted to the circumstances of the food that was available, and the terrain and circumstance on each particular item to enable the fish to conveniently gather the food that it needs according to the circumstances on each of the islands. And I believe that this is one of the strengths of life. Who would, if there was not adaptation on the individual scale, on the scale of species, we would be robotic indeed. Adaptation is one of the wonders of life. One of the wonders of life. But it's not an explication of Darwinism by any means. It does not explain the evolution of animals or of creatures or whatever, and certainly not that of man. It cannot explain the transitional forms at the level of phylum, class, and order. Now Darwin, a man of utmost integrity, acknowledged this. He acknowledged that the fossil record does not support him. But he said that sooner or later, as archaeology and as paleontology and archaeology progresses, that the missing links, the pieces, would be found. And now, 160 years later, we're still awaiting the missing pieces, the missing links. Let us go deeper. The debate has shifted from the fossil record to the microbiological. The Cambrian explosion is now seen as an explosion of information. The information is encoded in the DNA of all living things. DNA is being seen as the software of life. But how then could a code have arisen? A code as complex and as intricate and as profound as the code of all living things, incredibly complex. How this could have arisen through the mechanism of random variation and natural selection, it just does not work. It is inconceivable to have a code without a programmer. Who has ever heard of a computer code just arising by itself? A code presupposes purpose, design, and intelligence. And then there's another objection. Consider a mousetrap. In a mousetrap, you have the spring and the trap mechanism and the trigger, and you must have all of these components at once. They all have to come together, and they all have to fit together perfectly. Each must be in place for the mousetrap to work. But evolution, the evolutionary tree, does not do it. It does not hold water with the mechanism of the mousetrap. It cannot explain. It could explain maybe a part of maybe the evolution of the spring of the mousetrap, or the spring, or the trap mechanism, or whatever. But how these parts all come together is outside of the theory of evolution. Consider a flagellum. A flagellum is a motor. It's like an outboard motor that propels microbes. It has a rotor revolving thousands of times a minute. It has a drive shaft, and it has bearings. It's an incredibly complex mechanism. All these parts must come together and fit together all at once. It has bushings and bearings. It can reverse direction, going around this way at tens of thousands of revolutions per minute, and then change, come to a stop, and change and go around the other way. This is an incredibly complex mechanism. All the parts must fit together, and evolution cannot explain this. Not at all. Each part cannot somehow evolve separately and then come together. This difficulty with Darwin is called irreducible complexity. Furthermore, no species comes into being alone. All species exist as part of an ecosystem. The unit of formation of life is not the single species, but the ecosystem in which it is embedded. As with irreducible complexity, the mechanism of random mutations and natural selection cannot get a handle on this. It has nothing to bite on. We're talking about ecosystems, all life being part of a larger ecosystem. The chimpanzee, the ape, the gorilla, the elephant are all part of an ecosystem, which in itself is part of a larger and larger and larger ecosystem, all of which is conducive of existence, conducive of living, vibrant life. Natural selection cannot get a handle on this. The natural selection mechanism of random mutations and survival of the fittest just cannot get a handle on this, cannot explain this. It's simply outside the natural selection mechanism. Another difficulty is that the prognostications of Darwin's theory have yet to be replicated in the laboratory. Hence, it fails on its own scientific pretensions, because science is predicated upon reproducibility in laboratory conditions. Not even an earthworm can be replicated in the laboratory starting from dead matter. And I should not say not even an earthworm, because an earthworm, which is able to move, which is able to respond to stimuli, and which is able to reproduce itself, is an incredible complex mechanism. well beyond the power of contemporary science to replicate in any way. No one has ever been able to create an earthworm. That these objections have been ignored or brushed aside tells us something of Darwin's scientific pretensions. Darwinism is a sociological phenomena, a cultural artifact that has given rise to the crassest materialism. Now, the idea of evolution was not original with Darwin. In one of the most remarkable events in intellectual history, Alfred Russel Wallace came up with the same idea at just about the same time. On a remote island in the Malay archipelago, it happened. An Englishman, Alfred Russel Wallace, a botanist, was suffering from an attack of malaria. And in his delirium, he saw it all. A vast panorama unfolded for him. The most primitive species, an amoeba or protozoa, gradually evolving through immense eons of time to sea creatures, birds, land animals, the guiding mechanism being the survival of the fittest. Between bouts of fever, Wallace gathered sufficient strength and wrote a detailed essay explaining his theory and sent it together with a covering letter to Charles Darwin, whom he knew from correspondence was interested in the subject. This was essentially the same theory that Darwin had been ruminating on for over 20 years, but never got around to publishing as he continued to collect evidence. Wallace's letter prodded Darwin to bring out his famous book the following year in order to avoid being scooped by Wallace. Darwin panicked upon receiving the letter, writing privately in his diary that his life's work was smashed. A couple of his distinguished friends came to the rescue and quickly organized a joint presentation to the Linnean Society of London on July 1st, 1858. They presented a manuscript by Darwin and Wallace's letter, both of which were read before the society. This was indeed a singular event in the history of ideas. Yet Wallace's concept of evolution was deeper and more profound than that of Darwin. Darwin claims that all biological life can be explained through a directionist process of survival of the fittest and random mutation. Wallace, on the other hand, suggests that there are areas of the biological world beyond the scope of natural selection. Wallace postulates that some purposeful intelligence must be called upon to explain the fundaments of existence. For example, Wallace reasons that man's intellect, man's reason, man's artistic and musical ability, his wit, his sense of humor, his talent, and most important, his moral sense, the ability to know right from wrong, also his kindness, compassion, honesty, and integrity cannot be explained by the Darwinian mechanism of survival of the fittest and random mutation. Rather, this must be caused by an intelligence that guides evolution. Wallace insisted that man's mind was created by a mind. In place of the primitive materialism of evolution, we have a natural world that is designed. Wallace enunciated what he called intelligent evolution. That is, evolution as part of a designed and guided universe. In 1910, at the age of 87, he gave an interview to a reporter. It was a bold declaration for intelligent evolution. Whereas Darwin says nothing about the origin of life, Wallace postulates a definite act of creation. As he says, and I quote, "An honest and unswerving scrutiny of natural forces, and as he says, an honest and unswerving scrutiny of nature forces upon the mind this certain truth, that at some point in the Earth's history, there was an act of creation, a giving to the earth of something which before it had not possessed. And from that gift, the gift of life, has come the infinite and wonderful population of living forms." Think of it, an initial act of creating life. In reply to the question, "But in any case, you believe that there is purpose in creation?" Wallace replies, "It meets me everywhere I turn. I cannot examine the smallest or the commonest living thing without finding myself uplifted and amazed by the miracle, the beauty, the power, and wisdom of its creation. Have you ever examined the feather of a bird? I almost think a feather is a masterpiece of nature. No man in the world could make such a thing or anything or anything in the slightest degree resembling it." He goes on to say, "The scales on the wing of the moth have no explanation in evolution. They belong to beauty, and beauty is a spiritual mystery. What is the origin of beauty? Evolution cannot explain. Why indeed," Wallace goes on to say, "why indeed are a butterfly, a deer, and an antelope beautiful?" Falls completely outside of the mechanism of random mutation and natural selection. It seems to me that Wallace nicely summarizes his work when he says, "My contribution is made as a man of science, as a naturalist, as a man who studies his surroundings to see where he is. And the conclusion that I reach in my book is this: that everywhere, not here and there, but everywhere, in the very smallest operations of nature to which human observation has penetrated, there is purpose and a continual guidance and control. And then there is consciousness. According to Wallace, man is given a soul or a spirit. He says nothing in evolution can account for the soul of man. The difference between man and the other animals is unbridgeable. Thank you, brothers and sisters, for allowing me to share some thoughts and insights with you. We would so much appreciate your opinions and comments. Let us go forward on this most beautiful, magnificent day in Berkeley, in the edible schoolyard here at Martin Luther King High School in Berkeley. Thank you, and bye for now.